Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Jassim Ahmed and I will be your host for today's discussion. And what our discussion is going to be, we are going to be talking about a new report that examines Gaza's dire situation and potential pathways forward with the coming of a second Trump administration. Titled Dealing with Trump, Israel and Hamas, the Path to Peace in the Middle East. The report is by the European Council on Foreign Relations. Its author is Muhammad Shehada from Gaza and Hugh Levitt. I am really pleased to say that I have Muhammad Shehada with me today. Welcome to the show, Muhammad.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Muhammad is a visiting fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations in the Middle East and North Africa program. Many of you will know him. He is a Gaza researcher, a real amazing source of information. He's currently serving as the Chief of Communications and Program also at the European Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor. He's contributed to a number of outlets, including Al Jazeera, The Nation, and The New Arab. I want to kick off, Mohammed, because your report covers a lot of areas, a lot of ground, from the situation on the ground to the coming of the Trump administration, Israel's policy of ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip. So let's begin with just discussing the situation on the ground right now with regards to Gaza, because that is where your report kicks off.
In regards to the situation right now in Gaza, there are multiple processes that Israel has unleashed on the ground. There's a process of mass starvation. What we see in northern Gaza in particular, they have not gotten any food for the last 70 days. They have to rely on rations that they have stored up from before. In Gaza City itself, the situation is not much better. In the south of Gaza as well, bakeries had to shut down. Food is very scarce. The price of a bag of wheat flour is astronomical. And the situation there is something that's never been seen in terms of the pace and the scale since the Second World War. That is something that even European top leaders have been telling us behind closed doors. At the same time, there is a process of mass extermination. It is indiscriminate, but at the same time, very discriminate. What I mean by that is that Israel targets people with enormous precision. If you look, for example, at the use of quadcopters, the quadcopter would identify a movable subject, incriminate them by distinguishing them as humans, and then shoot at first sight. But at the same time, it's indiscriminate because they are not seeking after any particular individuals. They're just shooting at whoever comes in their way. There's also a process of mass destruction. So one of the things that I tried to look at in the report was what is left in Gaza that would be salvageable on the day after to maintain any sort of rudimentary form of organized human life. And literally, there's virtually nothing left. So if you look at banks, 93% of banks have been destroyed. There are only three ATM machines in all of Gaza out of over 90 that were previously there before the war. Schools, hospitals, restaurants, companies, factories, cafes, mosques, churches, homes, universities. There has been this systematic wiping out of everything. You can see it more prominent or most prominent in Jabalia and in Rafah, where it's just a howling wilderness. It's a giant wasteland. And it's not an act of war where you can see that there was a use of disproportionate violence there or disproportionate force. It is very methodical, patient, slow. Israeli soldiers would plant explosive devices one home after the other. Bulldozers would move from one home after the other until there's nothing left. They literally take their time very slowly and patiently with everything standing in the way. And then you have the last process that comes to mind now. There are other processes as well, but the last one is basically the mass displacement and mass incarceration of populations in Gaza. So the IDF would go into areas in Jabalia, for example, and round up everyone there, divide them into groups, a group that would be mass incarcerated without any charge or suspicion just because they happen to be there, and another group that would be kicked and forced to go on a death march to the south of Gaza.
What's happened to Hamas in all this? And I mean, you painted a really bleak picture. We see this on our screens every single day. There's, of course, a number of reports that have concluded that Israel is committing the crime of genocide. Amnesty International is the latest with a 290-page report. But let's not forget that Israel launched this genocidal campaign in 7 October, wanting to eradicate, destroy Hamas. How close is Israel to doing that? What is the situation of Hamas on the ground?
The declared goal of the war, as you said, is the destruction and elimination of Hamas. There is the undeclared goal of finishing off the Gaza question. That is something that Israel has been very clear about since at least 2014. So previous rounds of assaults on Gaza were described as mowing the lawn. Israel would go every few years, cut off the blades, the heads, or the skulls of people there, a few thousands, and then leave and come back again and destroy tens of thousands of homes. This time it's about finishing off once and for all the Gaza question. The destruction of Hamas is sort of a sub goal coming out of that, but it is no longer the main goal. Very clearly, since the very beginning of the war, once you had Israel's defense minister, you have Gallant saying, we dropped all restraints. But in terms of Hamas's shape on the ground, there has been a depletion of its sort of ammunition, of its rockets. There has been sort of wide assassination of its top leaders. But at the same time, we see that Hamas managed to retain the overwhelming majority of its tunnel system and of its troops on the ground. They even managed to expand in some neighborhoods. They managed to deploy what is called Isnad Force, about 6,000 to 6,500 people with basic training on light weaponry, so ambushes, anti-tank missiles, and rifles. And you can see that they have managed to withstand any Israeli incursion on any area where, as soon as the IDF leaves, Hamas resurfaces immediately and regroups in that area by Israel's own admission. The last thing about them is that by Israel's own admission, they managed to re-establish and restore some chains of control and command in some areas of Gaza. So if you are to grade Israel from an A to F on that task, they failed miserably. They managed to deplete Hamas's, let's say, capacity to threaten Israel's population or Israel itself with long-term projectiles, but they failed completely at bringing Hamas down. To the contrary, they have created the conditions that would sustain a long-term Hamas insurgency in Gaza to make the IDF stay in the enclave nearly impossible.
I think that's probably one of the reasons, the failure to deplete and destroy Hamas is probably one of the reasons why Netanyahu is changing the goalposts and now claiming victory and feeling triumphant over what's happening in Syria. What we did in Gaza has helped to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and he's being very triumphant in that. Partly because, as you mentioned, Hamas is still active. So in terms of numbers, though, what kind of numbers are we talking about? Depletion, how much has Hamas been depleted? Prior to the genocidal campaign, numbers of Hamas fighters were probably around 20 to 30,000, 25,000. Do we know any more about the actual numbers itself?
Basically, in the depletion of the rockets that Hamas had, I would say projectiles, not rockets, because they did not have explosive heads. They had sort of a force that can carry them to a distance. They did not have any destructive impact. But in terms of Hamas's projectiles, about 90% of them have been depleted by Hamas using them or the IDF targeting warehouses. But at the same time, we see Hamas making use and recycling unexploded Israeli ordnance in Gaza, where there is an estimated 10,000 tons of unexploded ordnance in the Gaza Strip that Hamas can recycle into improvised explosive devices or even projectiles to launch on Israel. The other thing is, in terms of Hamas's manpower, the estimate is about 6,000 to 7,000 Hamas members altogether that have been killed since the war started. That includes Hamas's military wing as well as its political wing as well, because Israel went after senior politicians in Hamas, even rank and file members of Hamas, as well as Hamas's civil servants in the Gaza government. So if you look at how many Hamas members have been killed, the estimate would be about 6,000 to 7,000.
And the report discusses how Israel is trying to cultivate new actors who may take on Hamas. Some, as your report goes on to point out, and we'll discuss later, affiliated with ISIS and Daesh. How is Israel doing that? If I can quote something you mentioned in the report, it says when Israel raids an area and kills its fighters, militants, they leave behind the guns, the AK-47s, on the bodies of those killed. And then clans and gang members find and take those guns after the army leaves. So what is Israel actually doing by trying to cultivate these hostile actors within Gaza itself?
The source of that particular information was actually a Palestinian Authority former minister who's now working closely with Israeli authorities to as a liaison between them and international organizations and the private sector to get trucks into Gaza. So a source of huge knowledge on this topic. We got also similar reports from the ground on this as well. Israel tried in a multitude of ways to sort of recruit or create an internal rivalry to Hamas to finish the job that Israel itself has failed to accomplish, to do the dirty work of Israeli occupation forces. So, for example, Israel reached to a number of big families and clans and tribes in Gaza and told them you would be in charge of distributing and storing aid, which means you would have control on the ground because Israel says whoever controls the food and water has the ultimate control in Gaza. They reached out to a number of families in that regard, but that failed immediately in the bud for two reasons. The sort of makhatir, ashair, the tribal leaders, the community leaders, they told Israel, we do not have the capacity nor the will to do that kind of thing. We are happy to do it along with the local government in Gaza and what is known as the emergency committee, but we cannot do it as a separate entity. There were few families that got carried away and lured by the Israeli offer, and just the simple tactic of intimidation by Hamas pushed them back from that line of thinking. The other approach that Israel tried was basically leaving weaponry for gang members, for tribes and families to pick up, to sow chaos as much as possible in Gaza. There are other incidents where there is a high likelihood of Israel directly arming specific families. So, for example, if you look at Dir al-Balah, a family called Al-Agra or Qur'an, they were sort of parading around with M16 rifles, American-made M16 rifles, brand new, in broad daylight, in public, in the street, in the open, without Israel going after any of them, although the IDF was stationed about 800 meters away. At the same time, recently, I was in a conversation with the board of trustees in ANIRA, the organization that's distributing aid in Gaza. And he told me that in one of the meetings they had with COGET, the Israeli coordinator in the territories, occupied territories, a question was raised. What would happen if someone's home is attacked by gangs and he takes out a gun or a knife to defend the home, and a drone sees that, an Israeli surveillance drone captures that incident? What happens to that individual that's defending his home from criminals? Kogat told him explicitly the drone would incriminate him as a legitimate target immediately. He would automatically be registered in the system as a legitimate target. While at the same time, you have those teenagers, literally kids and teenagers, running around with M16 rifles, shooting it up in the air in broad daylight, in close proximity to the IDF, without anyone going after them. The last example that is the most obscene is what we see in Rafah and some areas in Khan Yunis, where you have gangs of about 200 individuals, mostly run by two well-known, notorious criminals. One of them is Abu Shabab Yasser, and the other one, Shadi Sufi, who are benefiting and operating under either passive or active IDF protection. So they set up even a military compound-like structure in Rafah, right at the road where the trucks go through. And the Israeli military would see this happening right in front of them, sometimes only 100 meters away from the troops. So literally they can see them with the naked eye. They do not fire a single bullet at those gang members that loot the overwhelming majority of aid. At the same time, those Israeli troops would shoot to kill any civilian that enters that area because it is regarded as a kill zone or an extermination zone. And they would specifically assassinate any policeman that tries to prevent the looting. And we saw some prominent examples of that about last week, where Israel even bragged about targeting Hamas individuals from the police that Israel claimed were trying to loot the aid, just as shameless as that. And we've gotten reports and also firsthand accounts from senior officials in the United Nations who were saying that we are telling Israeli counterparts, you need to do something about that. The Israeli alibi was extremely hilarious. Do you know what they told them? Israel said, we cannot fire at those gang members because we might injure some of the humanitarian workers and that would give us bad press. Literally. Although Israel has targeted a Guinness, it accomplished a Guinness record in targeted assassinations of humanitarian workers at a rate that was not seen in any global conflict in modern history or human history in its entirety. I've never seen any conflict where you go after humanitarian workers and kill over 300 or 400 people.
Yeah. What is in terms of why are they trying to keep those hostile actors, as you mentioned, alive? I mean, because there's a section in your report which speaks about Gaza's governance structure. What is this governance structure? I mean, we spoke about the fact that the Gaza has become this dystopian wasteland. What is there to govern, given that Israel's plan for the north appears to be ethnic cleansing and to push Palestinians ultimately out of the Gaza Strip? What is this governance structure which they're trying to create in the north, at least?
Well, basically, it's important to establish what was government like on the day before the war. And you had a local Gaza government that is often referred to as the Hamas government, although it's a misnomer because most civil servants there are either ideologically independent or belong to other factions. Hamas is one component of that government, of the civil servants there. But that government opens up calls for applications every year for people to apply, even in the police force. And that government was cleared and vetted by Israel itself. So if you look, for example, at 2019, when Israel allowed Qatari aid to fund salaries to civil servants in Gaza, Israel demanded from Qatar a database of the fingerprints of each recipient of their aid. And Israel went very patiently through the list of every name of civil servant in Gaza, and they decided to blacklist only 300 individuals. The rest were vetted and cleared by Israel to receive salaries. So that is the local government that you have in place. So when British media, for example, says the Hamas Health Ministry, this is very explicit genocidal apologia or genocide denialism, because that health ministry is a technocratic one. There is a pool of recruitment from all different factions, as well as people that are even ideologically opposed to Hamas. Now, with the government's shape, as soon as the war happens, Israel starts targeting government officials, senior government officials in different ministries, the education, the economy, the finance, the agriculture, the police. So the government goes underground. It becomes more or less decentralized in some aspects. And it alternatively merges into what is known as the emergency committee, which is sort of like a grassroots formation, autonomous to some level in each neighborhood, in each area, where you look around you and you see who are the civil servants that are available in this area. And then you form a structure together that would work on the most important issues that need to be continually managed during a genocide or a war, which is health, the economy, food, and security. And these are the areas that it's working with. The emergency committee includes in its ranks the government civil servants, volunteers, representatives of virtually every political faction in Gaza, as well as community leaders and tribal leaders, makhatir and ashair. Now, Israel's idea was to create something alternative that is dystopian. It's coming out of a horror sci-fi movie. They wanted to build a gated community, what they refer to, or a humanitarian security bubble. In other words, a concentration camp in northern Gaza. The prototype was supposed to be called a neighborhood called Atatra in Beit Lahia. And they wanted Atatra to be the prototype pilot project for this, where you had an Israeli-American businessman called Moti Kahana pitching that idea to the Biden administration. And he was asking to build 3 concentration camps where people inside it would be subject to complete security control by foreign mercenaries from Britain and the United States that would be armed and ready to shoot to kill anyone who disobeys. And each person there would have to submit their biometric data, fingerprints, retinal scans every day to receive food and water. Basically, that's it. So that was the Israeli alternative. The problem that we try to point out in the report is that Israel is deliberately trying not to come up with a realistic alternative in Gaza because it wants to sustain the chaos. It wants to sustain the societal collapse because that helps to expedite and provide cover for its genocidal campaign in the enclave.
And so I guess the aim of the report is to show the European governments and also Arab countries there is an alternative to the Israeli plan of ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza. And that is exactly what you're trying to show. And one of the ways you're trying to show that, I guess, is showing that Israel is also holds the main responsibility for why the ceasefire agreement has failed. So you have a section on the negotiations and the multiple stages that's gone through. We know the Americans have tried to pin the blame on Hamas for why the ceasefire agreement has failed. But can you walk us through those various efforts and where we are with the negotiations? I mean, Trump recently, he tweeted, he says that there will be hell to pay if hostages are not released. I mean, I don't know what he means by that because Gaza, as you mentioned, as we can see, is a dystopian wasteland. What else can Trump do? It shows that violence hasn't worked, bombing hasn't worked. What can be done to release other than what Israel's already done? So where are we with the negotiations and the ceasefire talks? And can you just talk us through what's happened over the past 14 months on this front?
Yeah, absolutely. That section was heavily redacted. It was supposed to be way longer than that. We had to really squeeze it into as much concise description as possible. But if you want the short narrative, first on Trump. So Trump, basically, as soon as he issued that threat, Hamas's answer to the mediators was basically, bring it on. Let him ride his highest horse. That was the verbatim quote. Because there's nothing, there's literally, not even virtually, literally, there's nothing left in Gaza to bomb anymore. So
Yeah, exactly.
By July, Israel runs out of targets in Gaza. That is what Israeli sources are saying behind closed doors. Running out of targets doesn't mean running out of Hamas targets. It means running out of targets, period. All kinds of targets in Gaza. Nothing left to bomb anymore. So in early September, when 6 hostages were executed or killed in Rafah in a tunnel there, Netanyahu holds a cabinet meeting and he asks his security and military leaders, how can we exact a price from Hamas for killing those hostages? And what they tell him verbatim is there is nothing left to exact a price from Hamas, which is corroborated by the Americans telling Israel, you accomplished anything that could be accomplished militarily. And Israel's own former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, a war criminal, on his way out, he did an interview in which he said, all objectives have been met. There's nothing else to accomplish. There's nothing left to bomb, basically. So that is on Trump's threat. On the negotiations and how it worked out from the beginning, you remember for the first 4 to 5 months, it was completely banned to use the term ceasefire in Gaza.
That's right.
That was a no-go. In the US and the European Union as well, everyone had to tiptoe around it and use the term pause. It was not allowed to use the word humanitarian ceasefire or ceasefire in general. That was a no-go zone, completely forbidden. I've never seen anything like this. Like you saw senior European politicians who struggle, and even Canadian Prime Minister at some point, a video of him struggling to articulate the word ceasefire without saying ceasefire. It was hilarious. But I think around February, the Americans come to the realization that Israel has failed to destroy Hamas in Gaza and that they will be there when this war ends. By March, the articulations that you saw with the Paris meetings, the Paris summits, 2 of them, and then by April, we have a concrete proposal for a ceasefire with multiple phases, 3 phases, that then Hamas agrees to. And as soon as Hamas delivers the answer and says, we agree to that ceasefire, Netanyahu okays, green lights the invasion of Rafah. Exactly, literally at the same time. So Biden tries again, and this time with an Israeli version of that ceasefire proposal. So the Israeli team, the chief of Mossad, the Israeli chief negotiator, Nitzan Alon, I think, they come up with a formula that they think is perfect for them. And they're too afraid to offer it to Netanyahu because they know he's going to say no to it. So they give it to the Biden administration. And then Biden comes out in that public conference giving a very, very lengthy explanation, trying to charm Israeli public audiences and Israeli politicians. And he presents the Israeli proposal. And he says this is an Israeli proposal. That's what's on the table. Hamas accepts that on July 2nd. As soon as Hamas accepts it, the mediators inform Hamas that Israel is also on board and the United States is also on board. What Netanyahu does next is basically he attempts an assassination against Muhammad Deif, the chief Qassam commander. He launches massacre after massacre in Gaza by bombing schools and dense refugee shelters. And then the assassination of Hamas's chief negotiator, Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of the movement. And then he imposes 4 conditions that the Americans and the Israeli negotiating team themselves, they say these conditions are there to sabotage the talks, to destroy it. So number 1 is the condition where Israel maintains its occupation of the Philadelphia axis. Number 2, the Netzarim corridor, which means no allowance of refugees returning to the northern half of Gaza. About 1 million people that were displaced forcibly by Israel. And then number 3, he demands that Hamas provides a full list of the hostages that are there. Although Hamas kept telling mediators, we do not have a full scope of which hostages are where in Gaza and who is alive and who's not, because the chain of command was deliberately destroyed by Israel. We need the ceasefire in order to have an overview. And then number 4, he says, I want way more living hostages in the first phase. And presenting these 4 conditions, everyone says this is going to sabotage the talks. So what the Americans decide on doing next was enormously spectacular. They go with Netanyahu's 4 conditions as they are and present it to Hamas and say, this is our new proposal. Do you take it or not? Yeah. And that's the August round of negotiations. So Hamas refuses to even go to the table at that time. They say, we had an agreement. That agreement was sort of endorsed by the UN Security Council, by Biden himself, by Israel itself. Why should we go to Netanyahu's imbecilic, moronic conditions? And the Americans decide to blame it on Hamas. But before they do that, they do this sort of fake, spectacular, theatrical performance of saying we are very close to a breakthrough. There is enormous positivity happening at this moment. And 2 reasons why they did that, according to mediators that I spoke to and negotiators as well. Number 1 is to prevent Hezbollah and Iran from retaliating against the killing of Hezbollah's senior commander at the time, the top militant there, and Ismail Haniyeh. So the Americans wanted, with this fake positivity, to tell the Iranians and Hezbollah, no, wait a little. There's a breakthrough. We're very close to a ceasefire. And number 2 was for Kamala Harris to have her DNC happening without any interruption. As soon as that is over, the US decides to engage in an unprecedented round of gaslighting and rewriting of history, where they sort of weave a narrative in which they say Hamas is the one saying no to the Biden proposal. Israel accepted every proposal on the table. That's literally their position. They think that the rest of the world lives in a parallel universe where we do not have access to media or social media, and our only source of news is Jake Sullivan's briefings in the morning. It's absolutely imbecilic, but it's even more shocking. I was recently at a meeting in Geneva, and there was an American former top diplomat there that's very close to the Biden administration. And he genuinely was saying the exact same line. There are proposals for a ceasefire on the table. Hamas is rejecting all of them. Israel accepted. The suffering in Gaza is real, but blame it on Hamas because they are refusing to entertain these offers of ceasefire. And then an Israeli person in the room who held the senior security portfolio in Israel itself formerly, he stands up and he says, this is not correct. You're rewriting history. And that was a hilarious spectacle to behold.
Yeah, it was. I mean, anyone who has been following this closely knows the American position has been quite very scandalous on this. And the Israeli public know this as well, especially the families of the hostages. They know Netanyahu has not does not see the lives of the hostages as a number 1 priority. And right from the beginning, the way Israel has conducted this campaign, this was not a hostage release campaign. This was really a genocidal campaign. And it was really clear from the outset. But I want to move on.
If you look at some examples, for example, the Bibas family, Kfir, Sherry, Jordan, and Ariel, I think, Hamas offered to release their bodies and the dad, Jordan, and they told the mediators that they were killed in an Israeli airstrike. Netanyahu refused. Early on before that, Hamas offered to release 2 hostages unconditionally without any price. Netanyahu refused, to the extent that Hamas said, we're going to just drop them at the border and leave them there. You do with them whatever you want. And Netanyahu refused. The border is a kill zone, so if you drop them there, they would be killed. There were way more Israeli hostages that were killed by Israeli military fire than the army has managed to rescue from Gaza in military operations. If you look, for example, at Hamas's proposal on October 9th, they tell Israel that civilian hostages, we are willing to release all of them if you refrain from invading Gaza with a grand invasion, not ending the war, but just refrain from invading Gaza so that Hamas can manage to find them and return them to Israel. And Israel refuses. For Netanyahu, he is interested in maintaining the hostages as long as possible in Gaza to provide cover for this genocide.
Yeah. Let's move on to another part of your report. You speak about Israel's strategy or goal in Gaza, and you mentioned that there's a five fingers strategy. I've not heard that term before, to be honest. What is that? What is Israel's five-finger strategy that it's pursuing in Gaza?
Well, it existed until 2005 when Israel had its settlements in Gaza. It cut Gaza with different settlement blocks and military corridors in five small cages or enclaves. So there was a block of settlements in the very north of Gaza that was Nassanit and Eretz and Sinai that cut Gaza from Israel itself. And then there were settlements between Gaza and Deir al-Balah Nusrat, like Netzarim, that cut them from each other. And then there were the settlements of Rosh Qatif that cut Khan Yunis from Rafah, and then settlements in Rafah itself, in the Mawasi area, that would cut Rafah from Egypt. And in each around each block of these settlements, Israel maintained sort of a heavy presence of military forces. And that's exactly what you see right now, minus the settlements, although it is very much on the way to be rebuilt in Gaza again. So in 2005, up until then, I remember it very vividly. If you wanted, as a Gazan, to go from Gaza City to Rafah, you had to be stopped at a checkpoint called Abu Holi in a vehicle. Like, nobody's allowed to cross that checkpoint on foot. Everyone had to be in a car. So if you had a donkey or a horse, you needed to shove it into a vehicle, a van or a truck. You cannot drive it there. You cannot ride it there, sorry. And you cannot walk on foot. And an Israeli teenager manning that checkpoint, sitting on top of a large tower, would stand there with a rifle, a sniper rifle, and point it at people. And according to his mood, he can close down that checkpoint for hours or for a whole day or for multiple days. So I had the experience where we were stuck in a car there for at least 6 hours in boiling heat in the summer. We're not allowed to step a foot outside because you needed to stay in the vehicle. If you go outside, you would get shot. And that was basically the system that Israel had in place there. Now Israel had re-established a system in Gaza that's way worse than that one. So they are working on re-establishing these corridors. There's the Miflasim corridor now between Jabalia and Gaza. Netzarim between Gaza and Deir al-Balah. There is a Kisufim between. It is on the way of being established between Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis. And then there is Sofa between Rafah and Khan Yunis, also on the way to be established, and the Philadelphia corridor between Rafah and Egypt. If you look at Netzarim, for example, it is 4 kilometers wide. There are whole towns and cities that are wiped out because they were swallowed by that corridor. It's 4 kilometers wide, multiplied by the whole length of Gaza, so about 10 to 12 kilometers long. And this area is completely wiped out, not a single building in it. And there's 19 IDF military bases there where soldiers are stationed. They play football and barbecue and have parties, apparently. And their military bases are supplied with air conditioning. While the rest of Gaza, not just the rest of Gaza, only a few meters away, you will see piles of bodies littering the ground of people that Israel murdered, being eaten by cats and dogs and decomposing in the open, meters away from soldiers partying and barbecuing and playing football. So this is what Israel has on hand. The other dimension that is spectacular is banning people from returning to the north. That was not something that was there in 2005 or prior to that. So now Israel has shoved and crammed the overwhelming majority of Gaza's population in the Mawasi area and Deir al-Balah, the only areas that are sort of habitable in Gaza at the moment. And in northern Gaza, you have about 400,000 to 500,000 people still there that Israel is trying to incrementally ethnically cleanse and push to the south. And once they move south, there's no way to return back at all. So the corridors are there to guarantee a one-way movement.
So I mean, it's a nightmare situation, and the question is, So we get to the next part of your report, which is, who are the governments and the countries and the actors that will enforce this nightmare scenario on the Palestinians in Gaza. Netanyahu, you point out in the report, is looking for Arab states to do its bidding. And is looking for subcontractors who will come in. I mean, both of us were in the Doha Forum, and we were in a session where former Trump administration official Jason Greenblatt, he spoke, and he said that when Trump comes in, his second term will begin from where he left off in his first term, speaking about the Abraham Accords, that the Arab countries will simply have to sign on the dotted line and move on from the Palestinian issue and accept the Abraham Accords. It's as though the genocide did not happen. I mean, interestingly, I mean, the Saudi official that was there on that panel, he pushed back. He said no for Saudi Arabia and others. The normalization with Israel runs through a Palestinian state. That's basically what he was saying. And we are not in the same place as we were, meaning Saudi Arabia in 2016. And when Trump left, we're in a different place. The Arab world is in a different place. That was quite a common theme in the forum. The Arab public is in a common place, meaning that they have seen what Israel is really like. How can you now live with a genocidal state on your borders? That's the question Arab streets are asking. That's the question I'm sure many Arab regimes are asking. So who would Netanyahu find as his subcontractor to push through this nightmare situation?
Well, there are at least 4 ideas on the table. The Israeli idea for Gaza, there are no competing visions for Gaza there at the moment, aside from one, re-establishing settlements in the Gaza Strip. Nothing else is on the table by any Israeli political party as a vision for the day after. Netanyahu keeps pushing his generals to come up with plans that the generals themselves write in the morning and then criticize in the evening in Israeli media and say these are unworkable, because he says no to UNRWA, no to Hamas, no to the Palestinian Authority, and no to Israel running Gaza itself, which means there's no other alternative. So the Israeli narrative, the Israeli vision for Gaza is reestablishing settlements, pretty much at the moment the mainstream one that is gaining more and more traction. There's an Egyptian vision, which is re-establishing or establishing a committee in Gaza that builds on the emergency committee that's still there. So it is called the Committee of Community Support or Social Support, where it would be headed by a team of technocratic independent individuals from, for example, the business sector or academia, and they would be under the subject to the Palestinian Authority, and it would be formed by decree of the President Mahmoud Abbas. But it would rely on the civil servants from the Gaza government in Gaza, as well as the PA's own civil servants that have been sort of lying dormant for close to 2 decades, and other civil servants that they can bring from the West Bank. That vision Hamas agreed to. The Europeans are sort of okay with it. The Americans are okay with it. And some sources say that Israel itself is okay with it, because this entity is not the Palestinian Authority, but is sort of under their supervision. So it accomplishes Netanyahu's vision of neither Hamas nor the PA. But the only person that is obstructing at the moment is Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president. And that is for 2 to 3 reasons. Number one, because that committee would have its own independent funding. So the PA will not be able to siphon off commissions. But at the same time, it is because once you establish an entity with its own independent funding, you are replacing the PA or the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people by recognition of the international community. That's how they are dealt with. So you are establishing this apolitical entity to provide services and not raise any talking points about the 2 states or 1 state or ending the occupation. And the other fear is that if that entity is established in Gaza, and Trump works on allowing Israel to collapse or weaken the PA in the West Bank and annex major chunks of the West Bank, the center of gravity would be Gaza itself, but it would not have a political entity to advocate for a Palestinian vision. It would have this technocratic apolitical entity. So there is the third vision that is on the table, which is the American one, American Israeli, they reached out to prominent Palestinian businessmen. There was a recent report about one particular businessman of those that was met with in Malta by the CIA and offered about $18 million as a payout to himself to accept running a committee in Gaza that sort of caters to Israel's occupation and become its subcontractor. And that builds on the gated community concentration camp idea. Then there is the idea, the last one, which is championed by an organization called Jinse in Washington, Jewish American organization. I forgot what it stands for, but something about security, something. And their vision is very much also being championed in a copycat of it by certain regional forces and certain countries from the Gulf region that are sort of pushing for a proposal of putting security forces on the ground in Gaza to do the work that Israel failed to accomplish. Now, there is good news and bad news. The bad news is that Trump is unlikely to exert any pressure on the Israelis. The good news is that Trump doesn't care for details. He's incapable of processing details. So if a package is presented on his table of saying, if you agree to this and this and that, that would get Saudi Arabia on board with the Abraham Accords, he might go along with it. Because at the same time, we are getting this from a lot of sources in Washington, senior diplomats, senior civil servants, and think tank researchers who are saying that Trump is this time very keen on getting a Nobel Peace Prize. You might find this a bit hilarious, but that's what they emphasize that he wants at this point. So the hope now is on a moderate Arab force. If, for example, Saudi Arabia can live up to its word and try to insert a positive, sustainable vision on Gaza in an overall package of normalization that includes in it a Palestinian state, that would have a lot of positive traction in Washington, D.C. At least there are a lot of individuals that would try to stand behind this and use it as a resisting force against the dystopian visions of Netanyahu or his allies in the region.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I mean, Trump isn't one known for details. And if the Saudis and his Arab allies are opposed to an idea or a plan, then of course he's like, look, these guys aren't for it. How can we enforce this plan? So, yeah, it's very difficult to see how even the Saudis will accept this nightmare scenario. But we'll have to wait and see. I mean, who knows what could happen. But you also mentioned in your report, it is for the European Council on Foreign Relations. So what specific actions do you recommend the European governments to take in establishing a scenario that is not what the Israelis want, at least what something more viable for the Palestinians, at least, because that is what you're trying to present to the Europeans, to the Arab countries, to say, look, the Israeli one is a nightmare situation. We don't want to be there. This is an alternative. So what are you recommending to the European governments?
There is plenty that they can do. The question is, would they do it? But for example, the first and most important thing is to not indulge in the Trump administration's fantasies and think that they are capable of moderating Trump's policies or talking sense to him on their own, or let's say like running along with his policies and saying, yeah, maybe it'll lead to something positive. Around the time of Trump's peace to prosperity deal in 2020, that was catastrophic by all accounts, there were European Union officials that were saying that we see it as a catalyst to reviving and reinvigorating the negotiation process between the Palestinian and Israelis. That was batshit crazy. It was like absolutely lunatic. So number one is to not do that again. From the very beginning, to draw a very explicit red line. The European Union is facing a horizon with very certain Israeli annexation of the West Bank, very increasingly certain resettlement of Gaza, and very certain Israeli military occupation permanently in Gaza, as well as a continuation of the war in other shapes and forms. So they need to draw a clear red line to that with clear consequences. There is an association agreement. There is the Horizon project with Israel, where Europe provides funding and support to Israeli organizations that collaborate with European counterparts. There are a lot of tools, for example, sanctions on Israeli ministers or the settlement chapters of the World Zionist Organization or Amana or the regional settlement councils in the West Bank. There are a lot of sanction tools that can be very effective in sort of paralyzing or at least impeding the colonialization project in the West Bank that's going to run rampant now. It was already reaching an unprecedented pace during Biden's administration, unseen in Israel's history. Now it's going to go even more crazy. They can sort of, in one way or another, slow that down. And there is the contact group that they have with, which is called the Global Alliance for the Two-State Solution, that they can use with Arab regional forces with more influence in the Trump administration, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, for example, to try to influence a more moderate approach on Israel-Palestine. But the problem at the same time is you have a European Union that is willing to, in one way or another, undermine, if not fully dismantle and rewrite international law if it benefits Israel. You see that, for example, now with Israel invading Syria unprovoked, without Syria firing a single bullet against it, and bombing 800 targets within less than 10 days, with the whole world silent on it, with Biden even blessing it and considering it something positive. And you see at the same time the new European Vice President and High Representative, Kaja Kallas, making her first news conference yesterday or press conference yesterday, in which she very keenly and deliberately avoids using the terms Gaza, Israel, Palestinian. And one of her predecessors, he told me explicitly that this is deliberate, that as soon as they walk into office, their own advisors, their own general managers, and their own counterparts, other leaders in the EU, tell them to avoid the Palestinian topic because, quote, it's too complicated, or, quote, it will burn a lot of political capital. In one way or another, like Europe has undermined itself enough at this point that there is a need, there's not even a need, there's an opportunity for them now, a very easy opportunity handed on a golden plate for them to show that they can live up to their purported principles and charter.
Just before we finish, Muhammad, just quickly on a personal question, what's the situation with your family in Gaza? I mean, just quickly before we end.
Well, some of them, they managed to leave, some are still there, and some are no longer with us. The ones that left, basically, my grandmother, for example, she's been in Cairo now for nearly a year. And as soon as she came out, my mom texted me and said, you have to come immediately because she's not going to live longer by the look of it. She was completely bedridden, unable to move. She was merely skin on bone, and her feet were swollen in a very frightening way and had all sorts of medical and health complications that she's still suffering from because of, like, one impact of Israel's starvation is not just starving today, it is the devastating permanent impacts it leaves you with for the rest of your life. And that is the most prominent aspect of the genocide, is that Israel is sparing no one these consequences, elderly, children, women, men, civilians, etc. I saw my cousin on the street in Egypt, and she was the pride of the family. She was known as this beautiful woman with fair skin and smooth hair. And I saw her in the street and I didn't recognize her. She had shrunken, literally, physically. She was also skin and bone. Her skin is very rough and wrinkled up, and I didn't recognize her. And that's the people that survived, and that was many months ago. Now, for the ones left behind there, it's absolutely insane. The Gaza that I know is gone, and that's something to wrestle with everywhere, every day, every moment of the day. Is basically, if you're familiar with the Nordic mythology of Odin and Thor and Ragnarok, this full planetary destruction, your whole universe is gone. And that is how it feels in Gaza. It's not only the destruction of everything and the killing on record scales, but it's also the people that are there are have been turned into ghosts. Everyone there is living with the mentality that their turn is next any moment now, that they are just inmates on a death row. And the people that are dead, the most painful thing about it is that they never got a chance to experience living in the first place. The person that I'm pained by his death the most was my friend Ali Adam. I believe he wrote an article once in Middle East Monitor. He was one of the most brilliant young people I've ever met. And he spent his time in Gaza consuming religiously a huge amount of intellectual knowledge. Noam Chomsky, Slavoj Žižek, other intellectuals, Norm Finkelstein, he would read it every day religiously. He was familiar with politics, domestic politics in the EU, in the UK, in the US. You can open up any conversation with him, and he would spontaneously, extemporaneously debate you on that topic, climate change, China, Ukraine, Russia, US, whatever, for hours and hours. And yet he never got a chance to live. His CV was full of educational accomplishments, but completely empty of any work experience. The most painful thing about his death is that I'm not over it, although it's been nearly a year. I don't even have anyone to mourn him with. He didn't get a chance to be known. He literally didn't get a chance to experience living. And that's the most devastating thing about people that Israel is killing there.
Well, heart goes out to you. My heart goes out to you, your family, and of course the Palestinians in Gaza who are being subjected to this horrific genocidal ordeal. And all we get to see is what we see on our social media posts and videos, and from the reading that we do, and the trauma that's been covered by MEMO and others. One of the most horrific things I read recently was just the sheer number of Palestinian children who are the only hope they have is that they will die. 80, 90% feeling, well, we're just waiting to die. And these are children, expressing their psychological trauma. And yeah, I mean, we pray for them, and inshallah, this horrific stage of subjugation and the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestine comes to an end. Thank you so much for joining us for a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. It's really honor and a pleasure to host you, Muhammad. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope we can come to our show again. I mean, speak more broadly about the geopolitics, not just simply your report, because you have a wealth of knowledge and you follow events on the ground in a really detailed way. So I really admire the work you do, and thank you for the work you do. And you and your family are in our du'as and prayers, and I'll speak to you soon. And those who have tuned in, thank you for tuning in for this week's conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.